Hi, Shalom. I am finally back with part 3 of my discussion of Counting the Cost by Jill Duggar Dillard. This is the final video in my little mini series, and if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that I had to take an unplanned hiatus from this book and this topic to take care of my mental health. But I'm in a much better place now, Baruch Hashem. And I'm also getting much more proficient with using my new tablet. So video production is a lot faster than it used to be. Yay! Just like with reading parts 1 and 2, I will be holding up the book when I'm reading direct quotes, but I'll be looking forward because I'll be doing the actual reading from the teleprompter. I still like regular books, okay? Don't judge me. All right. Without further ado, let's pick up this discussion where we left off. Content note, this video contains mentions of exploitation and various forms of abuse. I will be as vague as possible. Viewer discretion is advised. Any references to the traditional male/female binary and traditional gender roles are in context and does not reflect my own views. As said, this is part 3. I've been going through the book in chronological order and breaking it down. If you haven't already seen parts 1 and 2, you'll want to do that first. Otherwise, none of this will make sense. I will link both of those parts down below. In part 1, I covered Jill's earlier childhood up until Josh's abuse in 2002. The abuse came to light in 2006, right before the creation of the show. DHS, Department of Human Services, got involved, and it was a whole thing, and yet, in spite of all of that, the show went on, literally. I'm going to give you a brief timeline of the Josh situation, and then the bulk of this video is going to be about Jim Bob's atrocious financial abuse against Jill and her husband, Derek. So, during all of this, there was the Ashley Madison scandal. That was some weird dating website thing for people cheating on their partners. Now, what two consulting adults do is their own business, provided there's nothing deceptive going on. I don't have any kind of moral judgment about that, okay? But this does not exactly fit that criteria. Then in 2019, Josh's used car dealership was raided by the feds when child porn was found on his computer. And that is me getting around these censors, not making light of anything. As many of you probably know, he was charged for that. I want to clarify that he was not charged for abusing his sisters due to the statute of limitations. Josh's current release date is December of 2032. It's been pushed back a few times. Personally, I think he should be there for life. While the criminal justice system needs a ton of reform in general, people like him are the reason I support the existence of it. There are some people who just should not be on the street. Okay? Okay. Now we'll move on to the financial abuse subject. I want to point out a couple things about the financial component of the show. The show's income allowed the family to construct a bigger house. And by construct, I mean they used the kids as unpaid labor as a big part of the building. When the show started, there were 14 kids, and as I said in my Cult of Personality series about the Duggars, excuse me, they could only do everything they did because of the income from the show. Most Quiverful families live in extreme poverty. Hold on, I'm having issues with the teleprompter. Give me a second. Here we go. Now, things wouldn't have been so bad if there were fewer kids in the family or if the mom worked, but that is not how the majority of these families do it. And when I say extreme poverty, I mean food scarcity is a major problem for a lot of these families because they don't want any kind of outside aid. I know survivors who were in this situation as children, and it is not pretty, to say the least. There are way too many adult survivors of these groups who have medical issues due to not getting enough to eat as kids. In the book, Jill mentioned that the income from the show enabled to get all kinds of like regular food, beyond just ramen. She specifically mentioned ramen, and that detail horrified me. I only crave ramen when I am massively dehydrated. I cannot imagine eating it all the time. Ugh. The other thing I want to point out is that the Duggar children were thrown into the show without understanding how television production works as a job slash career. So they had no way of understanding that they were victims of child labor exploitation. Jill mentioned that a film crew from South Korea had them filming from 7 in the morning until 10 or 11 at night. I was talking to my therapist about the labor thing. We did some quick mental math and figured out that I often put in like 30 to 40 hours of unpaid church labor per week, and that was on top of part-time paid childcare. Severe health issues are disturbingly common in cult survivors. And if that's what it was like for me, I can't imagine how horrible it was for those poor kids. My therapist said that this fits the legal slash technical definition of slave labor. I was hesitant to call it that because these groups are predominantly white. But my therapist said that black slavery is only one example of legal slash technical slavery. If the definition of slavery is unpaid or underpaid labor in bad conditions, often under coercion, then this absolutely is slave labor. As said, in this world, children are not viewed as human beings with their own thoughts and emotions. Quote, I loved the times when we were all together, especially when it was just us Duggars. The presence of the film crew brought plenty of good things, but I quickly grew to dislike the way they sometimes wanted to spring surprises on us. I guess it made for good TV to see us react in real time to the news of whatever challenge or adventure they'd set up for us, even if it was just an escape room or a trip to a park. But it got to the point where I was feeling the stress nearly every time they were filming. Either I was trying to bury my discomfort and anxiety when they were springing a surprise on us, or my fake joy when we were filming something we'd already rehearsed. I had to keep my reality far away from the TV. End quote. Think about that last line. I had to keep my reality far away from the TV. This, my dear audience, is exactly why I say that reality TV is a contradiction in terms. As Jill became a teenager, the subject of romance inevitably came up. I've mentioned before that dating, as most people define it, is not a thing in this subculture. They do what they call courting, and I don't mean in an old days way, like more traditional approach to serious relationships. That is more traditional compared to today, but that is too liberal for this crowd. I'm talking about arranged marriage, essentially. They say it's not an arranged marriage, but if it walks like an arranged marriage and talks like an arranged marriage, it's a freaking arranged marriage. Quote, I knew my parents loved me and wanted what was best for me, so it wasn't like mom or pops were ever going to arrange our marriages or force us to marry someone. But without our parents' blessing, there was simply no way any relationship would ever be able to begin. Years and years of IBLB teaching had taught us that no good Christian child should ever consider going against our parents' wishes. Number one on the list of requirements in a future spouse was that we had the approval of our parents. Without that, it was game over before things had even begun. End quote. Jill met a guy named Derek through some acquaintance of Jim Bob. And I've said before that the Duggar family turned heads even in the South. Um, Derek's background was much more liberal and normal in a lot of respects. He only had one brother, and he had gone to public school. Another prominent detail is that he was fine with girls and women wearing pants. And this is a huge thing in some of these groups. Not so much in the one I was in. There were women who wore pants, but a lot of them didn't. And yeah. As the relationship progressed, Jill became increasingly nervous about the idea of being forced to televise her future children's births. She could tell her mom was not a fan of doing that, as you might expect, but women do not have choices or autonomy in this world. And that brings us to Jill and Derek's wedding. I know I'm using a lot of direct quotes in discussing this book, but I feel like I just can't do all of this justice by paraphrasing. The part I'm about to read took place on the morning of Jill and Derek's wedding day. Quote, "Hey," Pop said to some of the older siblings earlier in the day. "Chad," one of the producers, "and I have been finalizing some stuff on the new show, and I have some papers for you to sign here. Can you do it real quick before you leave?" "Sure," I said, not thinking much about it. Some of the big TLC and production people who weren't usually around were coming to town, so I imagine Pops was feeling more pressure than normal to get everything they needed together. "What's this for?" "Oh, it's just about how you're going to get paid." I looked at the papers sitting on the dining room table. Single sheets with white signature lines with each of our names printed. A few had already been signed. I didn't see any extra papers to read, and I didn't really know what it was about, but I didn't question my dad. After all, in all of my life, I had never had a reason not to trust Pops. He knew best and always had, so I picked up the pen and signed. End quote. Now you're probably thinking, how stupid are you? I get it, but I can't emphasize enough that this is not about stupid. This is a totally normal scenario in this world. Men run everything, and women don't have any choice, especially when it comes to finances. I need to point out that the Duggar children didn't have much understanding of the employment side of television production. They were not receiving any kind of regular paycheck, even after they turned 18. Jim Bob controlled all of the money, and we'll be coming back to the topic of Jill's signature on that paper. Jim Bob and Michelle tried to exercise full control over their children, even after they were adults and married with children of their own. When Jill got pregnant, her parents and TLC wanted to control when and how they announced their pregnancy. Not long after Jill had her baby, the old police report on Josh was illegally and unethically leaked to In Touch, a tabloid with graphic details. Jill was coerced by her family into doing a PR damage control type interview with, surprise, surprise, Fox News. And Josh was in the room during said interview. Now, as I mentioned before, Derek's background was much more normal in a lot of respects, and his concerns about Jim Bob and the exploitation grew over time. He and Jill were pursuing their own lives and wanted to do mission work in El Salvador. You can probably tell how I feel about that topic on the whole, but for a lot of young people in this world, mission work was really the only socially acceptable reason to move away from their families and do their own thing. So they moved to El Salvador, but were still making trips back to the US to do filming work for TLC, and they were also expected to do a lot of filming remotely. And bear in mind, up to this point, they had never received any kind of formal salary. Derek grew increasingly concerned. He confronted Jim Bob about this, and Jill described her reaction as bracing for impact. I know that feeling all too well. I got it so many times in the cultiverse. Derek refused to budge, and eventually Jim Bob agreed he would give the older siblings $80,000 each, which sounds like a lot, but when you factor in the years and years of unpaid labor, it's really not. Derek and Jill got suspicious, and they soon learned what Jim Bob wanted in exchange for the $80,000. I can't do this justice by paraphrasing, so I'm going to read another direct quote. Hold on. Quote, "The contract wasn't with TLC or any other network. It was with Mad Family Inc., a company that Mom and Pops had previously set up. In return for the $880,000 for the next 7 years, plus an unlimited number of years beyond that if the company chose, we would have to commit to making not just ourselves, but our children and any children yet to be born available to any show that Mad Family Inc. created or participated in. We would be paid for that work as well, but at a rate we would have to accept without negotiation. We would also have to sign an NDA, means non-disclosure agreement, which would remain active for the rest of our lives." End quote. The part about future children is pretty much exactly how black slavery worked. I'm just saying. Okay, now we're coming back to that piece of paper that Jill signed on their wedding day. For timeline purposes, it is now 2017. I had forgotten to mention that Derek's educational background was in accounting, and he eventually went to law school. They talked to an attorney who had no connection to anyone else in the Duggar family, and the attorney advised them to ask for the full contract that Jill had signed. And not surprisingly, Jim Bob refused. Jill and Derek did everything they could to try to get out of that contract, and they did eventually quit filming for TLC in the summer of 2017, but unfortunately, that was not the end of Jim Bob's influence on their finances. In 2018, he committed tax fraud in Jill's name, and he even deceived his own accountant about the whole thing. Obviously, everything he did is extremely illegal, but as we all know, people with friends in high places can get away with a lot. Jill recounted her experiences with starting therapy and reading the book Boundaries by mainstream Christian psychologists Cloud and Townsend. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about that book. It's received some criticism from mainstream therapists for not being as scientifically sound as some of the other books out there. And it certainly isn't the most in-depth psychology book I've ever read, but I majored in early childhood. I did have to take some psychology courses, and it uses terms correctly, and it uses them in the context of well-known gospel stories of Jesus interacting with people. I read it a few times after my escape. This book has helped so many Fundy survivors heal and establish much needed boundaries with toxic people. The fact that this is coming from actual psychologists who are practicing Christians gives this book a lot of respect in the Fundy survivor community. All right, that is a wrap on counting the cost. Thanks again for bearing with me until I was ready to film this video, and I'll be back soon. All right, bye.
If you enjoyed this video, please do me a huge favor and hit the thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon. Like you trout. Bye.